Yeah, it was just pacing.
You just kind of keep going, and the next thing you know, the background's going to open up, and you're just going to go right through that door.
And I disappear.
Two of my favorite people in the world, Brandon and Michael. Nice to see you guys.
Hey, Trishak.
Hey. I'm gonna give it a little bit of time for folks to join. Can't remember, is Brad already out? Yep. Okay.
He is. Yeah.
Yes.
Oof. Well. All right. So give me a couple of seconds here. Let me also copy. Oh yeah, I put the meeting note there. I'll put it again. Put the meeting notes in there. Feel free to put your attendance in there. I think we have a relatively light agenda. I know a lot of us are prepping for KubeCon and co-located event talks, so probably going to cancel next meeting unless somebody has something really cool to demo or something like that. Yeah, it's going to be hopefully, for as Trishak, for as bad as I think the holidays sometimes get, it's where I often get most of my like POC work done, because it's like there's no meetings, so it's just all right, I can heads down actually like try and focus on a interesting problem.
That's actually a good point. Yeah.
My teenagers don't let that happen anymore.
All right, cool. We can probably get started here. So just and let me also, for anybody who's joining now, put the notes in chat. Just a reminder, this meeting's being recorded. It'll be uploaded to YouTube a little while after. And your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. All right. So on the agenda, I know that there's a couple of PRs that are open that we probably wanted to talk through. Shame, obviously that Brad isn't here because I think Brad opened up most of them. Let me pull this up in a second. Or actually, first, if there's anybody new to the group who wants to introduce themselves, I know everybody on here is, even if they're new to the group, we're familiar with, but just figured I'd leave that open. Trishak, if you want.
I could start. Probably the suspect. Hi, I'm Trishang. I'm staff security engineer here at Datadog. Michael very kindly invited me here, and I'm very, very excited to see how I can help with the Secure Software Factory effort.
Yep. Cool. Yeah, and yeah, I was gonna say, so yeah, so I know a bunch of us are prepping for KubeCon in a couple of weeks and the talks for KubeCon, but we've been going through a bunch of different things there. Before actually getting into any of this, does anybody have any sort of big things that they wanted to bring up that either they're working on, that they need help on, anything that they wanted to, any topics for like, Fresca itself, any feature requests, any bugs that we need to start taking a closer look at?
Yes.
Remy?
So Brad and I, we started two efforts to create integration testing for Fresca. So Brad started something using GOS or GOSS, I don't know how you say it. And I started another one using Python test infra. And we would like to collect feedback from people to see which ones they like the most or they think is most useful. So I'm more the Python person, so I'm very happy with the test infra one, so I can like promote it a little bit. PyTest is great and it uses nice fixture and stuff. But Gauss also has some advantages. It's simpler. It's based off of a YAML file. So it depends what we want to do. But it would be good if people had like opinions or ideas about integration testing for Fresca.
Cool. Sorry about that. I need to stop sharing my screen for a second because for some reason, sharing my screen lately has not worked. It causes glitches on my end. What was the second one what was the Python one that you were talking about?
PyTest test infra.
Oh, PyTest.
I mean, it's a plugin for PyTest.
Okay, cool. Yeah, on yeah. Yeah, I love Python too. Though I don't get to write as much of it as I used to. Okay, 1 second. Let me see if this works. If I share. Let's see if this starts to cause any issues. Maybe it literally is just a Microsoft Edge. Nope, never mind. It's still causing issues. All right, I'm just gonna stop sharing. I'll deal with that later.
I was trying to think your max headroom.
Yeah.
Glitch out.
Yeah. It's like as soon as I click share, it just starts acting strange. And I don't even have like a lot of tabs open. I only have like, okay, 35 tabs. That's maybe more, right? Yeah. So
I just wanted to add, yeah, so for the this week on Friday, the in total meeting is happening. So we're going to be presenting that runtime attestation stuff. So if you guys are interested and if you wanted to like make comments, and I think it's going to come out like for community review. So you can make comments and suggestions on how to improve it and such. So that's moving along.
Sorry, Bart, could you explain what's new there? What do you mean by verifying in total attestations? Do you mean just links, or do you have
no, not in total attestations, runtime attestation. So it's a new predicate type we're creating.
I see. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and so that's Parth, can you get a little bit into like what that is, like how it's like we're using, we're looking at stuff like eBPF and similar to start to sign off on that?
Yeah. So we're using eBPF. So we're using a tool called Tetragon at this point. But what we're trying to do is make the predicate very generic. So it doesn't have to be eBPF, or it doesn't have to be like Tetragon or something. You can use whatever kind of tool you would like, and then you kind of put it in this kind of format. You're trying to make it like a standard format that people can follow, so that you have this runtime attestation. Especially like we're thinking about it at this point in terms of the build, right? So what's happening during the runtime of the build, we want to capture that kind of information. So is it reaching out to the internet, all those kind of things we want to capture, those TCP connections, all that kind of stuff, and then the different processes. So that's what we're trying to do. It is going to be relatively large, right? Because it does spit out a lot of information. So we're trying to like filter it down to see maybe we don't need to capture some of these things. And at the same time, I think there's a bundle. In Toto has this kind of thing called bundle, I believe, which I still have to
that's a salsa thing. I'm not sure whether that's an attestation thing, but yes.
What was that? So attestation bundle in Toto.
I see.
I can link it here. So basically this is, and I was speaking with Aditya about this, and I don't think it's been used yet. So runtime might be the first one. So basically this is like, it'll be a bunch of attestations that kind of like, amount to one basically, right? Because it'll be because it's going to be so large. A lot of information gets captured during runtime. So it's like, okay, how do we make it so that, and then we also to make sure that it's in proper sequence, because we want to make sure like, hey, this attestation ends here, and then we want the next one and so forth, right? So that's I think that's still a little bit open for discussion. We still have to figure that piece out, but we wanted to present the actual format of the predicate, right, and get some feedback and from that piece.
Yeah, it makes sense. I never understood why it had to be a per line thing, but yeah.
Yeah, it's just I guess a quirk with the JSON lines, format. I don't know why, I don't know why specifically that format, but
Right. Especially
It's
when
a nice
speaking.
format if you want to append afterwards.
I see.
yeah, from my understanding, it's just every attestation is a single line, so you could just and then it also makes it super simple because a couple of the other use cases that people have brought up is you can have like sub bundles and then one major bundle that's just all of the stuff associated, and it's very easy to just be like, okay, I have a bundle with these 5 attestations, or actually I only care about these 3, so I have a bundle with just those 3, and it's just very easy to sort of share around.
Yeah. I guess one concern that's naturally coming up now is what do you do when you have a very large attestation? I don't know how large it is. It's very funny. So don't quote me on this. I heard about someone producing a nearly 1 gigabyte SBOM.
Yeah, that might have been some of the folks who've been doing stuff with like Testify Sex, what's it called, Witness, because I know they've been doing stuff with trying to build SBOMs and stuff for the Linux kernel itself, while tracking literally all the files in there, and there's a lot of files in Linux, so yeah.
At that point, it might be just more efficient to just capture the commit of like the whole repo, no? But yeah, that's a different story.
Yeah, and I think that's actually something that is something that we're trying to also figure out with some of the stuff that we're doing, right? Where having a single attestation for a thing is, it's useful in the sense of being able to say, yep, here's everything, here's all that data right here and right now. But there is definitely some there is definitely some interesting, like, yeah, if you have a gigabyte file, sometimes it's like, I just, a lot of folks might say, hey, I just want to know about my initial, my first sort of like my shallow dependencies, right? Or my, just some shallow set of attestations. I don't need all the transitive attestations throughout all of history right this second, right? But they might still want to be able to have access to it through some mechanism. And it's something that I know we've been talking about in Fresca a little bit, is with some of the stuff that we're doing, right, we can go in and pull in via Fresca other attestations as part of the build process, and then say, okay, cool, should we combine them into a single SBOM? Should we combine them into a single attestation? Or does it make sense to have some way of referencing them? The problem that we're seeing a little bit is we're seeing problems with how do you reference other SBOMs? It's like, great, you've referenced, let's say, a commit, but I don't have access to where that code lives. So does it make more sense to include additional metadata? Does it make sense to say, yep, sorry, this is the commit, and if you want, we can talk about an audit? I don't know if there's a great answer there.
Yeah, so Michael, if I could add to that thought there, so adding literally the hashes of every single file makes sense if you're going to do a sort of an in toto inspection where you're literally going to check the hashes of those files. If you don't, you could just be given, say, the pointer to the repo and then do a so-called like lazy check later. Does this make sense so far? That's sort of what we do with the Datadog agent integrations. We do provide hashes of all the files, but we never reach anything like, it's always like a few hundred kilobytes at best.
Yeah, and I think on that level, like even, a commit ID or even something like a recursive hash. So something like the way Nix does it, right, where they just are able to sort of yeah, I know it can only go so long without saying it. You could deterministically list out all files, let's say in a repo, and be able to just sort of get the hash of all those files in essentially what's like a Merkle tree, so that you could go back and say, here's a single hash, and that single hash represents all these other files. Yeah, it doesn't include the hashes of those files, but if you did, for example, if you did have a file and said, hey, does this file live in that
Yeah, right.
thing, you can answer that question via an inclusion proof.
Oh, that's
But
very interesting, Michael, because Fuchsia actually does this with Tough. They provide the Merkle tree roots of all the packages, which are basically just files in directories, right? So yeah.
oh, cool. Yeah. That's definitely something that I know we're talking about, and it's also something a little bit tangentially we're talking about with Guac as well, right? Which is like, hey, Guac, it might make sense to sort of say, if you have a database where you can just have, like, it's not the actual attestations, but if you have a database where you're actually taking the various information from all these attestations and combining everything into something that can be queryable, sure, why not include as much information as you need? Because you could have multiple gigabytes. It's a database. You could just query it. But the actual attestations, you probably still want to keep relatively small and portable, because the intention here is that people actually download this thing and do something with it. And if in certain cases, we're already seeing that the combination of SBOMs, attestations, security scans, and everything else is significantly larger than the 5 megabyte binary that you're actually distributing. And at that level, it just gets complicated to distribute it. Cool. So along those same lines, with some of the stuff that we're doing with Fresca, and just as let me give a reminder, Parth, do you remember what day our talk is?
I do not. I believe it was I'll double check here.
It should be on the sked.com or whatever it's called, shed.com. So let me double check here. Okay, yeah. So ours is Wednesday, October 26th.
Yep, at 5:25.
5:25 Eastern. So whatever that may, so that's what, an hour before that. So it's 4:25 if you're actually on site.
No. It's the same time zone.
Oh, it's the same time zone? Oh, okay,
Yes.
never mind. Cool. Yeah, we'll be just sort of giving a once again, like another introductory sort of talk to folks who are kind of getting on, looking at this stuff, and so on. Okay.
And there's also going to be a runtime one.
Oh yes,
happening
at Cloud Native Con, right?
Cloud Native Con, yes. And that, again, I can't see my own schedule for some reason.
If you go to, yeah, it's kind of annoying. I found that if you go to speakers, look up your speaker.
Oh,
like look
really?
look up you as a speaker, and then click on that. Yeah, it's not the.
Yeah, because I click on my profile, it's not showing. That's annoying. Okay. Continue. I'll come
Yep.
back to it. Oh, here
so-
we go. I found it actually.
Oh yeah, feel free to just
Oh,
put
it's
it,
not. showing up.
stick
Yeah,
it in
okay.
there whenever you're ready. So a couple other things. And so this is one of the things that is probably going to be coming down the line maybe a little bit later in the year as we start to after KubeCon and after some of these other things kind of get released. So Salsa 1.0 should be getting released soon. And there's a couple of things that we need to kind of get done with Salsa, which is, so with Tecton chains, doesn't include, what was the thing again? Doesn't include the materials correctly, and I'll just put no way to know the inputs / sources. So one of the things that we're looking to kind of get out of here is also figure out how to capture the actual environment in Tecton chains. So one of the things that I think had come up, right, Parth and Brendan, was, as it turns out, if we look at the actual attestations, we have a recording of a build that happened, but we don't really have a recording of the actual inputs to that build. Now, with that said, my understanding is Tecton just merged pipeline attestations, which now should be that end-to-end attestation. So you should be able to go in and actually fetch literally the entire information about that build. So including the, hey, here is the upstream commit ID that you pulled it, for the code that you pulled in, and then that should be enough. But we probably want to just make sure that, once that does get officially released, what we need to do there just to kind of integrate that. And if there's any sort of quirks, because once again, I haven't really taken that close of a look, but I know that there was issues before about like, how do you get that attached to the actual resultant image? But even then, like, I'm sure it's probably at least okay for now while a lot of that sort of stuff is being sorted out, if at least the attestation is available, because then you could forward it anywhere, right? You can attach it after the fact to the image and it's not a big deal.
Yeah, so that I haven't tested it. I'm on mute. Oh, no, I'm not. Okay. I haven't tested it myself. I'm not sure if anybody else on the call has tested the pipeline attestation yet, but that should solve the problem. I know that Tecton, one of the other maintainers, they were also working on they realized that the config source is not coming through. So they were working on adding that, exposing that out through I believe annotations or or results or something, that so that pipelines can actually pass that information out to chains down the line, kind of thing. So it's not being captured as a task run attestation, and they realize that that's an issue. So they're making a fix at the pipeline level to get that forwarded. So that's still being worked. So eventually that will come through for the task run attestations, but most likely the pipeline attestation should capture that information. So
for the rebuilder, are you looking for reproducibility?
So this is so the rebuilder piece, so this is something separate, which is so one of the things that's being talked about in Salsa is ingesting a Salsa attestation to turn it back into a build for the sake of rebuilding. So this is stuff like, for example, with like, some of the stuff that was also discussed with stuff like in Toto layouts and stuff like that. Like, could you go and, let's say, run the same build against multiple builders? And one of the things here from the Salsa perspective was, could you take, like, is there a chance if folks gave enough information in a Salsa attestation, could you, and assuming you know the spec of the build, right? So that's also another proposal that I'm throwing out to the Salsa team, is having specs for the actual Salsa build types. Like, if you had all that information, like, here's, the source I downloaded these Java dependencies or whatever. If you had all that information, could you essentially reverse engineer it and then rerun the build. And whether it's reproducible is another thing, but could you go and then repeat that build and then be able to say, hey, I reran that build. I ran a similar set of SCA, other sorts of scans. They both seem largely to give me the same sort of information. I believe I can, essentially it's a way to verify the salsa build a little bit, because that was one of the big things is, could somebody go and take, different salsa attestations and say, great, the open source folks are doing, are running their build this way. We kind of want to, run an audit against that, right? Once in a while, like take one out of every, do a sampling of their builds and say, yep, one out of, let's say, every 100 builds or whatever looks good. It seems to, I'm running through their build, largely seeing the same sort of outputs. Now, obviously, the easiest is just to say, well, let me take your build config and rerun it. But I think the thing that some folks are starting to say is, could you take the output of salsa and then say, well, this ran on GitHub Actions, now it can run in Fresca. It ran in Fresca, now it can run in GitHub Actions, assuming you have access to everything and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, changing CI systems is going to be a interesting challenge there.
Yes, and I think this is the sort of thing that it's most likely we're not talking about for hyper complicated systems. Like, I doubt we could probably do the same thing for Fresca itself, because Fresca is a bunch of different components with a bunch of different shell scripts all running together. But we might be able to do it for certain smaller things. Like, I can imagine, hey, running Go build, whether you're running on GitHub Actions or Fresca, largely the same thing. Trishank?
Yeah, no, thanks. I'm glad someone. So I strongly support this sort of like reproducibility idea. Not quite exactly, not necessarily bit by bit, but right. I think if you read the upcoming government regulations, what they expect from us, I expect things like this to be quite common, actually, especially with auditors. I'm curious to see what everyone thinks here in the room. So things like Fresca, it seems my understanding right now is you have to install it manually, right? Especially for like greenfield projects, this makes sense. What is everyone's thinking in the room? Do you think that CI/CD systems out there are eventually all going to produce salsa attestations?
Well, personally, I mean, I would love, a few of us on here, right, are part of the salsa steering committee, and so we'd love to see that kind of come together. I don't know if that's, going to be across the board, but I do think that there's some interesting areas for us to explore on that front. Like, I think that what I would love to see is most, like open source, right? Especially stuff from the Linux Foundation. And this is stuff that I know that separately with the CNCF, we just released a survey where we're trying to ask folks like, CNCF projects, are you doing salsa? If not, why? Why not? And we want to be able to kind of, pull all of that in and, generate, and try and get those projects to all generate salsa attestations. But we also recognize that probably not everybody's going to be doing that.
No, that makes sense. Thanks. And especially for CNCF, encouraging something of Fresca, which is obviously a CNCF project, encouraging it to be one of the best practices for CI/CD makes sense to me.
Yeah. So just a small point. Technically, we're under the OpenSSF.
Oh, my bad. Sorry, I misunderstood this.
Well, yeah. So it was kind of a thing.
Just leave it at that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was a whole thing, but mostly it's like getting stuff into the CNCF is also a whole sandboxing thing, and also a bunch of other stuff. And then also OpenSSF was kind of like, hey, this is more of a generic security kind of secure build tool, and that's sort of hitting some of these other things. So when it came to the supply chain integrity group, it was like, oh, okay, but there's also, it's very much in the spirit of partnership. Right. So the CNCF is also like, hey, we're very clear that this is an implementation of the CNCF's best practices,
I see.
but while still trying to be clear that the idea here is you're not only building cloud native here. It's a cloud, if you follow these rules, like you're running a cloud native piece of software that allows you to run secure builds of arbitrary software. And there are some additional sort of conversations that have started on, they're very, very early on, just to be clear, of like, hey, could Fresca, if OpenSSF, let's say, ran Fresca as a service for certain tools within, you know, the Linux Foundation here, like, could they, you know, could it run as an extra builder? Right now, I believe a lot of the recommendations are to use GitHub Actions and those sorts of things, but it doesn't work for everybody. And so, or also, you know, could we run Fresca as a rebuilder for some of these tools so that we could also show, hey,
I see.
yep. And then that sort of rebuilding aspect, once again, I recognize that it's hard to go and reverse engineer a thing and have it rerun as something else. But if, let's say, for a set of things that it fits quite nicely in, you know, a few folks were like, hey, that would be great, because then the adoption from these other projects is nothing, right? They, as long as they're generating salsa attestations at an adequate level, Fresca could then ingest those salsa attestations, convert them into Fresca builds, and then rebuild them.
No, I like it. It's a very valuable idea, I think, especially in conjunction with Brandon's tool for building reproducible container images. Be very curious to see.
Yeah.
Still a work in progress. That's why I ask about reproducibility, because it is not fun to try to implement yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the smallest things show up. But beyond that, I think one of the questions I had when you're talking about the salsa, the rebuilder, and where you're trying to include some of this stuff, like what was the pipeline, what it looked like, how much of that do we want to say needs to be included in the Git repo? And so then it's just a check out of that Git commit and you know exactly what they used to build it, versus how much do we want to say needs to be packaged either as an attestation or a separate artifact associated with the image that we create, assume we are creating an image.
Can you repeat that one more time? So
yeah, just kind of thinking through the data that you want, how much that data makes more sense just to say it needs to be included in the repo when you commit the repo. So GitHub Actions,
yes.
there's like a .github directory in the repo already. You got your git commit, you know your commit ID, you know exactly what ran through GitHub Actions without having to have something separate packaged with the image, a separate thing to say, what did it run? What steps did it go through? So I'm curious how much of this is cryptographic attestations where we're putting extra details in there and signing stuff like that, versus just saying, we could just look at the git commit and see exactly what happened in there.
Yeah, so I think on that front, that's actually something that, and let me see if I will post it in here. It's still very early on in a draft format. Very early on in draft, but one of the things that we were looking at, or what I was looking at, was, could we go and like one of the things that you mentioned, the idea could be, look here at this git commit, and here were the inputs to the build script here. That's it. That's the only information that's kept. Like, I'm not including, you know, a ton of information. I think that's probably okay as well. Does that answer your question, right? Like, because like the answer there of like potentially just like, I can imagine, for example, given that a lot of stuff that happens like to build Fresca is just running these make commands. And so if you just were to say, I ran this make command against the root of this git commit, or this git repo, it's probably enough to tell somebody, yeah, as long as you give me an environment that contains these things as dependencies, and that could just be a like sort of a combination of it could be a combination of like, you know, the build environment, right, plus the make command, and that's and the actual git commit, and that's probably enough to run rebuilding as long as you have access to those things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it gets you rebuilding. It doesn't get you reproducibility, because there's always going to be externalities, stuff like that, that's going to break reproducibility in that scenario, but it gets you rebuilding.
Yeah, and so that on that front, like, I think inevitably some folks are going to want more or less, but I think for that, like, that baseline is enough there. And because this is also something that we've been talking about from the salsa perspective, right? Like, which is at some level, it might be enough to just say, here is a snapshot of the build environment. Let's just say you have a container, you pull all the code and all the dependencies down, or not even all the dependencies, right? You pull the code down, the code has pinned dependencies with hashes, let's say, in it. All you need to do is just say the digest of this snapshot of that image, that's the entire build environment. And granted, I think with some of that, right, like that's a good start. Some folks are going to say, yeah, I don't have access to that snapshot. How did you build that snapshot is also a bit of a question. But I think that sort of thing, yeah. Cool. Jay?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, in terms of what we're talking about here, especially the creation of these artifacts and a lot of these outputs, there's in CDF, there's a team that's working on a supply chain maturity model. It's also from Google Tecton, and they're working on a model that's specifically supposed to be something that runs as a bolt-on to Salsa on the back end, where they talk about artifact lifecycle, deployment management, release management, that whole thing. The only thing they don't include there is end of life. But I think that in terms of what gets produced, and I guess how it's maintained and handled thereafter, I think that might be something to consider as well, versus how all these artifacts are maintained. That's just the 2 cents I wanted to throw in there, because that conversation is happening. We talked about the CNCF and OpenSSF, but in the CDF, that conversation is happening over there in one of their work streams.
Yeah, and Parth, I think you've been attending some of those meetings as well.
So yeah, it just started yesterday, and like it didn't fully happen yesterday because not everybody showed up. So I think it was an initial discussion yesterday.
Yeah, the 18th is when the next meeting is.
Right. So we just had an initial kickoff meeting yesterday, but I think it didn't go well. So we're gonna revisit on the next meeting.
Cool. Yeah, and I believe, yeah, like we've been having some discussions as well with the CD Foundation about some of this stuff as well, and I believe tomorrow, right, there's a demo at one of the supply chain groups in the CD Foundation. We'll also be demoing Fresca there. Just real quickly, I think there's a couple of interesting things that's coming out of so from our understanding, based on some of the conversations we've had with the CD Foundation, is the CD Foundation's kind of said, hey, the CNCF, OpenSSF, and some of these other Linux Foundation groups, they have a lot of the technical stuff down pat. They have that on lock, they have that all locked up. The CD Foundation is very focused also on some of that like higher level, like business need, what is the process of this thing, like thinking about the supply chain also from the perspective of, hey, how do the lawyers get involved when a supply chain attack happens? Like what should that look like? So they've been very focused also on that sort of thing. And to be clear, this is stuff that we're also very interested in. Sort of, we're not going to get too deep into the actual the process side of that. We'll let the legal experts handle that. But from the perspective of like, is there data that could come out of Fresca that could help, that? And that kind of ties into some of the other stuff maybe after this topic that I want to get a little bit into for Fresca. Parth? I thought, oh, maybe not. Along those same lines, one of the things, and it's something that is, I'll put a pin in it for right now. The SSC framework that I know, Jay, you've been helping evangelize here at the OpenSSF. One of the things that we are, once some of that gets sorted out a little bit, I know one of the things that we want to be able to do with Fresca is say, hey, what can we do to, we know that Fresca itself is building stuff that we expect to then maybe be ingested via that same sort of framework. But what sorts of things can we do from a dependency ingestion standpoint? So that like when we're running builds, are there things that we can do to say, hey, while ingesting those dependencies into the build, we're doing these things, which then mean we're sort of compliant with that same framework. And I'm sure we'll have discussions as that sort of becomes more fleshed out.
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, we just got voted in to the supply chain integrity working group. So we will be working on right alongside Fresca and Salsa. I got to get with Jory and Khalil to establish a new set of meetings. Right now we have our community and technical meetings, much like this one, but now we got to establish meetings as a SIG under the supply chain integrity working group. But once we do that, we'll have a best practices working group. We'll have end users working group and supply chain integrity working group, all joining in to work on this right alongside Salsa, and then of course I'll be over as well in the CDF with what they're doing. Yeah, this is going to be. I mean, we are the stuff that we're working on, man. This is going to be phenomenal once we flesh it all out.
Yeah, cool. Okay, cool. So next up was one of the things that we were also looking at was, so Fresca is going to be generating a bunch of attestations and metadata like, SBOMs, Salsa. And the idea here, right, is some of it is going to be integrated directly into Fresca as a system. So like Salsa in particular is going to be integrated directly. And in fact, actually, let me switch this. And then, Fresca native. And then this is going to be project dependent. And then individual projects, right? We're going to have stuff like SBOM, so the idea here, right, is there's going to be things that are going to be built into Fresca, like, and I'm just going to say stuff like workload, there's going to be stuff that's highly dependent on how Fresca itself is built, right? Fresca, given that it's using Tecton chains and using all these different things in these different ways, we can do stuff like we can generate Salsa attestations that you run a project on the system, you get a Salsa attestation. However, there's also stuff here of, can we begin to develop essentially pipelines, like let's say a Go pipeline, a Java pipeline, a .NET pipeline, whatever, and say a Python pipeline and say, okay, great. If you're, let's say, running a relatively general, like a Go build kind of project, you will automatically integrate with, SBOM tools, right? So you don't have to add in anything extra. You just automatically get your SBOM gets generated based on, let's say, the Fresca opinionated way of doing it. And we want to make sure that obviously it's flexible, that folks can sort of say, hey, I want to swap out this, SBOM task with this SBOM task. But for most folks, like especially in the open source space, who are like, I don't necessarily really care, we might want to be able to take a bit more of an opinionated stance on that. And so some of the stuff that was also being talked about was with stuff like, OSV and CVEs and stuff like that. Like, could we start to work with perhaps some other projects in the open source space that are maybe doing You know, because I know some folks who had talked about something like, whether it's Dependabot or whatever, like almost like saying, hey, look, you're pulling in something that is an older dependency, even if, let's say, Dependabot didn't catch it or you didn't have it running on your thing. Also stuff like, you know, some of the security scanning tools that are out there, right? Whether it's Sifting Gripe or Sneak or whatever. And so I was curious if folks had some additional thoughts on what they want to see, assuming, right, like you have a generic project. Let's just assume Go for right now. What sorts of things would you love to see that just kind of come out of a build that you think that Fresca should, you know, it would be very easy for Fresca to do, as long as folks are doing like normal sorts of projects and don't have something highly custom?
Well, because it's front of mind right now, I was wondering if it's too new to think of, but what about Vex processing? If we've got Vex statements.
Yep. Yeah, that's definitely something that we can, you know, at least starting to look at, because that's something we're looking at with, for example, with Guac as well. And let me just. So yeah, Vex processing. I know some folks have talked about like ingesting also OSV data, or process, you know, being able to process OSV data. And some of this stuff is stuff that would, I guess actually there's some of it's going to be production, and then, whoops. And some of it's also going to be consumption as well, right? Because and actually, I actually not super whoops, this is probably a question for you, Eric. Do you also, because I'm still relatively new to Vex, do you imagine there might be also ways as part of in the build, somebody being able to produce a Vex document saying, yep, we've looked at the code, and because of like tags in the code or whatever, we can produce a Vex document that says this thing, and we want that to be an output of the build? Or do you mostly view it as a way of saying, when Fresca is ingesting dependencies, we should also be pulling Vex documents, or both?
I'm still learning it myself. So, but the latter is the first thing I thought of, but I think obviously both would be great. But that's why I prefaced what I said with this is still pretty new. I mean, Vex is pretty new to a lot of people right now. So I just want to make sure we have it on the horizon.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I think we want to look at, and it's something that we're relatively new at as well. And actually, is anybody really familiar with Vex at this point? Who's on the call?
It's front of mind for me because of the ChainGuard announcement with the Vex CTL tool they just put out.
Yeah.
Which I'm still challenged to get working, but you know.
Yeah. No, I saw that announcement as well, and it's something that I know we're interested in better understanding here. And what we'd love to be able to kind of see here is there's a lot of stuff, I think, from the consumption side, right? And you can sort of continuing the Vex impact statement. Yeah. So I think from the ingestion side, hey, that works. But I'm curious to know if folks have looked at stuff like, if I, you know, in my build manifest or something like that, have Vex documents to say, yep, you know, yes, I know there's upstream CVEs related to this thing. I've checked my code. It's not, you know, not affected. I think that sort of thing would be.
I think that's the initial thing that seems like the easier part of the problem, right? The collecting a vulnerability has shown up and now I need to figure out if it's a problem. That's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that sort of thing, at least for now, is probably something we'll have to put on the back burner. I don't think necessarily at this point, Fresca is going to take care of that outside of if there is a tool out there that can figure that out, right? Cool, we could just add, it's an open source tool. Cool, we can add that to Fresca's sort of tool suite and just sort of say that when you run a build, we'll also do this, this, and this, and hopefully be able to tell you, yep, we can generate a vex out of this thing because we've determined that you're not affected by this CVE or whatever.
We're interested. So at Datadog, my colleague Hossein Siadate actually has given a talk about it at B-Sites about producing source time, build time, and runtime SBOMs, right? Because this will give you very different information with varying degrees of completeness. One thing we're also very interested in, obviously, because, SBOMs are nice, but a 1 gigabyte SBOM, let's say, won't necessarily tell you whether you're actually vulnerable. So WEX, we think we're very hopeful in WEX. I'm a little bit out in the open. WEX to me seems like a very nice idea. I haven't even seen an open source database of WEX attestations that can help us solve this problem. So I don't see how companies are going to be able to do it. Look, I mean, everyone can build their own tool. So here's my concern. Sorry, the too long didn't read this. Yes, it'd be nice if Fresca can help us hook into tools that can produce SBOMs and WEX attestations for free. I think JaneGuard produced a tool for producing WEX attestations. I haven't taken a deep look at it, but that's the only tool that I'm aware of.
I think that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, Vex CTL.
CTL, it's pretty raw right now.
I see.
In fact, they're in an offsite, and I've been pinging Adolfo on the back end trying to ask him questions.
Adolfo,
they're
right.
busy partying right now. So as soon as he gets back from that, I'm like all over him. But yeah, it's an open source tool though. Even if it is theirs.
Yeah, to me, I think this is going to be a very big problem going forward, because if you look at that Salsa blog post talking about what the government wants by June and September of next year, SBOMs are one of them, and SBOMs are nice, but in many cases, I imagine we're going to need to tell the government, hey, by the way, here's our signed VEX attestation saying why we're not actually vulnerable to the CVE. So
the interesting part for VEX for me isn't necessarily what is and isn't vulnerable, but who's attesting that. And so that gets to be a challenge if you have like a central open source database out there that anybody can publish to. That doesn't give me a lot of value if people are just saying, hey, I'm not vulnerable to anything.
Yep. Who, when, why, where, how?
Yeah.
All of those questions about that.
yeah, so maybe it makes sense for like a third-party auditor to sign off on your VEX attestation to say, yep, it's legit, we checked it and it looks good to me. And if not, you're legally liable, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and to show off, like I don't want to derail the meeting, but to talk a little bit about one of the things that we're starting to explore, a few of us in the open source space. This is actually Remy and some of the folks from Google and some of the folks like Santiago from Purdue are starting to poke around with is a tool called Guac that we're also trying to have like stuff like maybe Fresca feed into, but the idea would be, and I'm going to share this real quick and hopefully it does not kill my machine again. Let's see. But the idea, right, is so I spent a little bit of time generating SBOMs and attestations for, okay, I'm still flickering, but whatever. About 10,000 or so Docker images or container images, I should say, and we can go in and actually look at like, never mind, I can't. Sorry, it's my entire machine is essentially unusable.
It's only your video feed that's flickering. We see the rest of the share fine.
Oh, well, so for me, literally, I can't move my mouse. It just starts stuttering and well, okay, let me try one more time.
It's because you're running a graph database.
Well, I'm running the graph database actually on my on a server I have sitting next to me.
I think we finally figured out what was causing Michael's machine to slow down.
Yeah. And also recently discovered, you definitely need to make sure that you index right from the beginning with graph databases, more so than any other database. Otherwise, you end up with situations where like, oh, you want to include, you know, a handful of like 1,000 new edges? Well, wait 3 hours, as opposed to wait like a second with indexes. But, you know, so some of the things here we're kind of like starting to do is look at, and a lot of this right now is, I don't want to say it's contrived, right? It is real data coming from real locations, but we do have stuff like, you know, hey, this package contains all of these files. And so we can actually see that, okay, this container over here depends on this package, which depends on that file. And so we can imagine here, the other thing that we're looking at is, cool, well, we can go in now and say, well, does this package have a vex, right? If this package, let's say there was a CVE, right? Does this package have a vex? And can we associate, or does this package have I should say, a vulnerability? And does that vulnerability have a vex related to that package? And we can begin to explore a lot of that sort of stuff via, you know, this sort of mechanism. And then we can also look at like, you know, are there shared files across multiple packages, right? And once again, this is very, 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 very early on. We've only ingested like 500,000 nodes and 2 million edges. But like the idea here would be, you know, we could even look at different versions of packages and different versions of some of these things where we can go in and start to look at that. And one of the things that we're looking at is, hey, like not a lot of people are producing this data right now. And could we have, since it's relatively simple to get some of this stuff set up in Fresca, could we have, you know, could we start going through some open source builds? Like, I don't know, like as an example, like, could we just take something like the Linux kernel and just run a build, ingest it into something like this, just to start looking at what's going on here and then see where we can go from there. And let me stop sharing before and I updated my video card drivers too, just recently, and thinking that maybe it was that, but no. Maybe it's time to reinstall Windows. Cool. Yeah, that's about it. But I think, yeah, I think to what other folks have said, we probably see. I run. It's typically I run Nix on my server, and that runs fine. It's just the actual Windows machine is the problem here. No, but graphics on Nix is impossible. So anyway, so with a lot of that said, any other questions, comments, concerns? Otherwise, I'll probably cancel next time, because next time is literally like a couple of days before KubeCon, and I think most of us are going to be prepping or be heading out to KubeCon. All right. Well,
And then we got holidays.
Yep. Yeah. That'll. Yes. But
is everyone going to be here at KubeCon?
Yeah. I'll be there. I'll be
cool.
Oh.
Okay. Great.
Some of us won't. Some of us will.
Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully I'll be there as well.
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
I'm trying to put together a group of people to go see the Ford Factory Museum the Saturday before, if anyone else wants to join me.
Ooh. Oh, well, I'll be arriving on the Sunday. Otherwise,
I've been there. For it. It's pretty nice, actually. There's like trains and everything in there, so it's worth seeing. So definitely recommend it.
I got rejected for Cloud Native Reject, so I'll be there. They give you a free ticket if you get rejected to so I'm there I've got a whole weekend planned.
Great. Well, nice meeting everyone. See you guys next time. Bye now.
Yep. Later.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yes, Brandon. See ya.